Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis Stone, Director of the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice at the Jacksonville Urban League. And this is our monthly conversation on racial healing and reconciliation. We've been doing this for over a year now, and we've had some excellent guests and dialogue and discussions, and we're happy to have you all here. Tonight, we have a very special guest, Professor Elliot Currie from the University of California, Irvine. He is a professor in criminology, law, and society. And his specializations are criminal justice policy in the US and other countries, patterns and causes of violent crime, race, violence, and justice, social context of delinquency and youth violence, roots of drug abuse, and assessment of drug policy. His work focuses on social and economic tools of American violence and problems of criminal punishment in the incarceration system of the US. His most recent book, A Peculiar Indifference, The Neglected Toll of Violence on Black America, explores the sources of enduring racial disparities and violent death and injury in America, and outlines strategies to reduce them. It was named in the New York Times as a notable book of 2020. He's an author of many works on crime, delinquency, drug abuse, and social policy, including Confronting Crime, An American Challenge, Dope and Trouble, Portraits of Delinquent Youth, Reckoning Drugs, The Cities and the American Future, The Road to Whatever, Middle Class Culture and Crisis of Adolescence, and Roads of Danger, Violent Crime in Global Perspective. His book, Crime and Punishment in America, revised and expanded in 2013, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in General Nonfiction in 1999. Lastly, he is a co-author of Whitewashing Race, The Myth of a Colorblind Society, winner of the 2004 Book Award from the Benjamin L. Hooks Institute for Social Change, and a finalist for the C. Wright Mills Award of Society for the Study of Social Problems. He is a co-editor, along with Walter de Caserdi, of Progressive Justice on an Age of Repression. And finally, in terms of awards, he's a recipient of the August Vollmer Award and the Mentor Award from the American Society of Criminology. He's a graduate of the Roosevelt University in Chicago and received his PhD in sociology from my alma mater, the University of California, Berkeley. So it's with great pleasure that we welcome you, Dr. Currie, and the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you, Dennis, and thanks to everybody for coming. Dennis, I'm delighted that we have the same alma mater. That's terrific. I wanted to talk today about some of the issues I raised in the recent book that Dennis mentioned, A Peculiar Indifference, which I published a couple of years ago. And, I wrote this book because I thought that as a nation, we were mostly ignoring or even quietly tolerating what I think we could consider one of the most fundamental inequalities that are imaginable in society, a radical disparity in the very prospect of survival itself, the chances of life versus death. And, I'd been studying violence for a long time, and it continued to shock and surprise me that we seem so complacent about this, that we seem so complacent about the level of violence that we routinely suffered in America, and how starkly the victims of that violence were shaped by race. We seem to accept these things, despite the fact that no other advanced industrial society on the planet comes even close to the level of excess mortality, disability, and racialized suffering from violence that we've come to accept in this country as an essential sort of natural part of the American landscape. And that disparity, of course, doesn't stand alone. It's just a particularly glaring example of a much broader pattern of systemic racial inequalities in health and well-being that sets the United States off very sharply from every other advanced nation in the world. The high rates of violent death among African Americans go along with higher death rates from diabetes, from heart disease, from stroke, higher rates of infant and maternal mortality, higher levels of exposure to environmental toxins, contaminated drinking water, higher rates of death at the hands of police. It all goes together. But we, and by we I mean the people outside the hardest hit communities who actually have the collective power to do something about these disparities, we for the most part have responded with what I described as a peculiar indifference. And I took that phrase from my title from the great scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, from his classic study, which was called The Philadelphia Negro, published just at the end of the 19th century. And he was writing about the neglected health problems of Black communities in Philadelphia and across the country. And he said, there have been few other cases in the history of civilized peoples where human suffering has been viewed with such peculiar indifference. He wrote those words back in 1899, and over 120 years later, we are still peculiarly indifferent. So my book was designed to try to shake that indifference. I explored what I think we know about the dimensions and the human impact and the causes of this enduring emergency, as I think it is. And at the end, I made some arguments about what we could do about it. When I published the book about 2 years ago, it painted a pretty dire picture. But I'm sorry to say that that picture got even worse after I wrote the book. I started that book with an account of a particularly tragic weekend that took place in my hometown of Chicago in 2018. I happened to be in the city at the time. And on that weekend, at least 71 people were shot in Chicago. 12 of them died. And I highlighted that particular weekend because of what it revealed in a kind of microcosm about the depth of racial inequalities and violent death and injury in the United States. All but one of the 12 people who died in that particularly violent weekend were African American. Nearly all of them came from a handful of neighborhoods in the city where violence had been a terrible presence for just about as long as anybody could remember. And that was just one weekend. There were actually 561 homicides in Chicago that year, again, cruelly concentrated in just a few of the city's largely Black neighborhoods. But here's the really bad news. That was 2018. 2 years later, in 2020, there were 769 homicides in Chicago. That was an increase of about 37% over 2018, the second highest number of violent deaths in Chicago's entire history. And as always, this was not an equal opportunity disaster. Of the Chicago killings over that year that ended at the end of January 2021, the race of the victim was recorded in most of them, about 681 of those killings. And of those 681 killings, 561 victims were Black, 68 were Latino, 49 were white, 3 were Asian. In the city as a whole, just under a third of the population is Black, roughly the same proportion as white and non-Hispanic. About 29% is Latino and 6% is Asian. So African Americans, in other words, were less than a third of Chicago's population, but they were more than 4 out of 5 of its homicide victims in that year. Non-Hispanic whites, also roughly a third of the city's population, were just 7% of its homicide victims. And so the violence in Chicago that year got a lot of attention from the media, not for the first time. And there was a lot of speculation about what it was about Chicago in particular that explained it. And, I can't tell you how many times people asked me, since I'm from there, in this kind of almost accusing way, if maybe it was kind of my fault, But the truth is actually much worse. Not only is my city of Chicago nowhere close to being the most violent place in this country, it's also just one of many, many American cities that saw homicide rise, often very dramatically, beginning in 2020, often continuing through 2021 and into this year, right up to the present. St. Louis, Missouri, for example, saw its highest homicide death rate in 50 years in 2020. Kansas City suffered the highest numbers of violent deaths ever in its history in 2020. In New Orleans in that year, homicides jumped by 60% in a single year. And something very similar happened at many, many places all across the country. The most recent and reliable figures that we have nationally on violent death in the United States come from the Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and they cover the year 2020. And you know, they're numbers, they're cold, and well, they're just numbers. But they do give us a picture of the racial disparities in American violence that I think should shake us to our core. And you can measure racial disparities in violent death in several different ways. Maybe the simplest way is to look at the different rates at which people of different races die by violence. And in public health, these are usually presented as the number of people who die of homicide per 100,000 population, okay? So in the United States, in 2018, United States as a whole, that rate was just under 6 per 100,000 people a year died by homicide. By 2020, it had jumped to a little under 8 per 100,000, a rise of almost 30% over the course of 2 years. That's absolutely unprecedented, and itself is alarming enough. But that overall national rate is, of course, an average that hides the deepening racial divide. In 2018, Black Americans died by violence at a rate of just over 20 per 100,000. That was roughly 7 times the white rate. By 2020, the Black homicide death rate rose to 28 per 100,000, close to 9 times the white rate. And that's because even though the white death rate from violence also rose over those 2 years, the Black rate rose much faster. And to put this change in another way, about 5,700 more Americans died by violence in the year 2020 than they had in 2018. Of those 5,700, a little over 4,000 were Black. That means that Black Americans, who are about 12% of the American population, accounted for about 70% of the homicide increase over those 2 years. That's bad enough, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. For Black men specifically, the numbers are worse. Their homicide death rate rose by 42% in just those 2 years. Again, something that's absolutely unprecedented in American history. For young Black men, who represent the group at highest risk of death by violence in the United States, the ratio of Black to white was 15-1 in 2018 and rose to 19-1 by 2020. So let's just pause for a minute and think about that number, just for a minute. That means that as of our most recent statistics, a Black youth in his late teens through early 20s is nearly 19 times as likely to die by deliberate violence as his white counterpart, same age. He's not twice as likely, not 5 times as likely, 19 times as likely. And in a way, even these disparities, huge as they are, actually understate the magnitude of the risk of violent death that's faced by Black Americans today. And that's because the risk for white people in the United States is itself actually very high by comparison with every other country in the advanced industrial world. So when we compare American Black men to American white men on this scale, we're comparing them to people whose chances of dying a violent death are themselves unusually high. If we're looking at it in a world perspective, higher than the chances of, say, German or English men, close to 20 times higher than the chances of violent death among men in Japan. But there's an even more revealing way to look at the magnitude and the human impact of racial disparities and violence, and that's to look at those things through the lens of what public health researchers call YPLL, which stands for years of potential life lost. And some of you guys may know this measure. The way it works is that you pick an age, usually it's age 65 in these statistics, as an endpoint, and then you calculate how many years of life are lost before that age as a result of various diseases or injuries, right? And some causes of death typically translate into greater numbers of years of life lost than others. So heart disease, for example, is the leading killer of Americans overall. More people die of it than anything else in this country. But because heart disease tends to kill people at relatively later ages, each death from heart disease doesn't usually add so many years of potential life lost, right? So if I die at age 63 of a heart attack, I've lost only 2 years of potential life if we're using 65 as the end point here, right? If I die in a car accident at age 15, I've lost 50 years of potential life, right? The result of this is that even though more people die of heart disease than of anything else in America, the biggest source of years of potential life lost, of YPLL in this country, is actually what's called unintentional injuries, which includes car accidents, as well as, for example, accidental drug overdoses. And that's because each one of these deaths tends to take place at an earlier age and therefore adds more to the total of lost years. And this becomes really, really important in understanding the human toll of violence in America. Because just like unintentional injuries, intentional injuries, violent injuries most often kill people at a relatively young age and often at a tragically young age. So in 2018, for example, the person with the highest probability of dying by violence in America was a 23-year-old Black man. Every time a young man that age dies, it means the loss of 42 years of potential life. So this concept of YPLL, in other words, is measuring not just how many people die of a given cause, but how premature those deaths are. In a sense, it's a measure of how much potential future is being destroyed by a particular cause of death for an individual and for a community. And the thing is that in the United States, this measure is very, very heavily shaped by race. So in the country as a whole, for all races combined, homicide was the 5th leading source of lost years of life in 2020. And again, it's very important to understand that this average number itself is very unusual in the advanced world, the developed world. It's generally only in some poorer countries of the global South that homicide even appears at all on the list of the biggest causes of lost years of life. It just doesn't show up. It does here. But the picture predictably gets much more troubling when we break it down by race. For Black Americans overall, homicide is actually the number 2 cause of lost years of life. It's exceeded only by unintentional injuries. For Black men in America specifically, violence accounts for almost 1 in 5 of all years of life lost by Black men in 2020. In fact, violence takes more years of life from Black men in this country than heart disease, stroke, and diabetes combined. Let me say that again, because I always find it a little difficult to believe, but it's true. Violence takes more years of life from Black men in America than heart disease, stroke, and diabetes combined. And the huge racial difference here profoundly shapes the overall picture of how people die between the races in America. Among whites, for example, far more years of life are lost to heart disease than to homicide, almost 6 times as many. Among Blacks, homicide actually edges out heart disease as a cause of years of potential life lost. And again, this sounds terribly abstract, like all mere numbers, and I realize that. But the thing is, it translates into real people's lives that are lived or not lived. It means whites, far more whites, live to be old enough to die of heart disease, that they have far more years to be somebody's son or daughter, somebody's parent, somebody's brother or sister, somebody's friend. You know, there's a poem by the great Chicago poet Gwendolyn Brooks that captures this fundamental aspect of racial inequality, I think very, very, very eloquently. Maybe you know the poem. It's called Beverly Hills, Chicago. And it describes the feelings of a Black family of modest means as they drive through one of the more affluent white neighborhoods on the south side of the city of Chicago. And she describes how beautiful the neighborhood looks. She says even the trash looks kind of nice in this basically white neighborhood. And she acknowledges that even these affluent white people have troubles, and that like everybody else, they're going to die at some point. But she writes, nobody is saying that these people do not ultimately cease to be. And sometimes their passings are even more painful than ours. It is just that so often they live till their hair is white. Well, there are lots of reasons why white Americans more often live till their hair is white, and their relative freedom from violence is one of those reasons. Well, you know, I could spin these numbers out indefinitely, but I promise I won't. My point is that I think these numbers should shock us into action, because what they describe is a truly profound and terribly destructive kind of inequality that I think amounts to a fundamental violation of basic principles of social justice. In fact, I think it's not too much to say that it represents a violation of fundamental human rights. And that's especially true because this is a totally preventable inequality. There's really no mystery about where this comes from. At least since Du Bois himself studied this problem back at the end of the 19th century, we've understood that this racial disparity in violent death is not accidental. It's rooted in processes of racialized social exclusion and stifled opportunity whose specific forms have changed somewhat over our history, but whose basic impacts have changed very little. We now have more than a century of careful research that keeps confirming over and over again what the problem is. It's that a toxic mix of harsh economic inequality, extreme poverty, marginal work, and the special obstacles, frustrations thrown up by racial segregation itself totally explain the racial violence divide. There's some differences of emphasis within that research, to be sure, but there just isn't any serious disagreement on the basics. We know what this is. We know what it's about, and we've known for a long time. And because we know what it's about, we also know what it would take to fix it. The problem truly is not the lack of knowledge here, it's the absence of action. I say a lot in my book about the details of what I think we might do that might actually work to turn these disparities around. But let me for now just point to a couple of things that I think are especially crucial, and we can talk about them later. I think the most basic principle is that we need finally to take this issue with the seriousness that it really deserves, which means that we need to be honest, we need to be bold, we need to think about solutions that match the depth and scope of this problem and that fit closely with what we know about its causes. And here I have to tell you, that as somebody who's been studying these issues for, well, I'm not even going to tell you for how long, it gets terribly frustrating to watch year after year our fundamentally schizophrenic approach to this issue. On the one hand, we understand, at least those of us who are paying attention understand, that the roots of racial disparities and violence are structural, they're systemic. And in fact, these days we talk a lot about systemic racism. But on the other hand, so much of what we talk about when we talk about remedies for violence focuses on the mostly cosmetic at best. So whenever there's a particularly awful weekend of violence or an awful year like 2020 or 2021, We see mayors and police chiefs and editorial boards and pundits talking for about the umpteenth time about how we need a greater community effort. So we come together as a community to grapple with this problem. It's kind of vague at what it is we're supposed to do when they say these things. And with all respect, the most important roots of violence lie outside of local communities, and realistically, they're out of the control of those communities. They reflect much larger national and even international forces that we can only enduringly confront on their own level, most importantly by national level action. So our long-standing tendency to put responsibility, so much of the responsibility, on the local community to tackle these problems, to me is a recipe for wheel spinning and ultimately frustration and even a kind of despair that leads again and again to a sort of paralysis when it comes to action on these issues. And we go through that cycle again and again. And I think that that kind of frustration can lead even good people to fall back on bad solutions. And we've seen a lot of bad solutions to this problem of violence, and we've seen them resurface again very strongly in recent years. We see that happening right now in the political arena. Crime is back on the political agenda in a big way, mostly not in a good way. In the absence of effective action, the rise in violence over the last couple of years is being blamed on pretty much everything but the actual causes. We see a lot of this, by the way, these days here in California. Over the last several years, we had put into place a lot of reforms that are designed to keep minor offenders, minor drug and property offenders out of prisons and jails. And there are now plenty of pundits and politicians and newspapers telling us that this is why homicide and armed robbery are going up in the state of California. So, never mind that they're also going up in many places that didn't pass similar kinds of reforms. Also that these reforms haven't actually affected people who commit serious violent offenses in the slightest. But this has become a pervasive message, and it's had a powerful, powerful impact on the political arena. This kind of argument was pretty much everywhere during these last midterm elections here in California and in other parts of the country as well. So I think that if we want to provide a better alternative that can really compel people's attention and get something done, we have to be bold enough and honest enough to tackle the problem. We've got to stop shying away from looking hard at the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is this: that in the midst of one of the world's richest societies, with almost unimaginable resources and technological capacity, great numbers of Americans of every race, but especially Black Americans, still suffer from a toxic mix of adversities that includes extreme poverty, desperately inadequate schools and public services, inaccessible and inferior health care, and an ongoing crisis of joblessness and youth disconnection that's disturbingly resistant to economic growth. I think that the communities that these folks live in can credibly be described as abandoned communities, and that abandonment worsened in the years of the previous administration. And it's that increasing abandonment, I believe, that accounts for the stubborn endurance of violence in many Black communities in America, and also lies behind its recent increase during the pandemic years. And if we really want to turn that around, we'll need to attack that reality of social abandonment at its roots. And I think the core of that attack has to involve work. And I'll just say a couple of things about that. 120 years ago, W.E.B. Du Bois said that the narrow opportunities afforded to Black people for earning a decent living was, as he put it, the center and kernel of the overlapping problems of Philadelphia's Black community and the issue that white society most urgently needed to confront. He said, memorably, that for white society to continue to place obstacles in the way of Blacks having a real shot in making a decent living through work was, and I quote, morally wrong, politically dangerous, industrially wasteful, and socially silly. And he said it was the duty of the whites to stop it. Needless to say, that didn't happen. And despite more than a century's worth of research since then, confirming Du Bois's insight, it still hasn't happened. You may remember that in the years before the pandemic hit, the news media were cheerfully celebrating the performance of the American economy. And there was something to that. Unemployment was falling. We were seeing the lowest poverty rates among Americans in years, including Black Americans. But even then, which now seems like a very long time ago, the real picture was a lot more complicated and a lot less rosy. Let me go back to my hometown of Chicago for a moment. At the height of the economic expansion that we were enjoying just before COVID hit, over 2 out of 5 young Black men in Chicago aged 20 to 24 were neither working nor in school. Over 2 out of 5. They were what people often call disconnected youth, and they were 6 times as likely to be disconnected in that sense than whites the same age. So everyone who's paying attention, right, knows that this is a recipe for disaster. The good news is that in the last few years, there have been some strong proposals put on the table to tackle the real world job crisis head on. It's a group of economists at Duke University, for example, that has come up with a proposal for what they call a job guarantee, meaning that if the private economy is unable to provide a job at decent wages for everybody who's willing to work, the government should step in and create that job. Those jobs would address the crying, unmet needs that have crippled our ability to reach our full potential as a society, doing crucial work like rebuilding the country's infrastructure, transitioning to an economy based on sustainable energy, providing critical healthcare, childcare, and other social services that are now often in desperately short supply, especially in poor communities, and much more. So if we do this, if we were to follow this kind of proposal, everybody wins. Not just the jobless people who get good and meaningful work, maybe for the first time in their lives, but all the rest of us too, who benefit from the socially necessary work that they would provide instead of their idleness. The collapse of our public healthcare infrastructure in the face of the pandemic, I think, makes this principle blindingly clear. Reversing our shocking underinvestment in the country's public health system, which has cost us so dearly during the onslaught of this pandemic, and building a world-class 21st century public health system all by itself would be a vehicle for a really exhilarating expansion of opportunity, especially for young people who are now marginalized and disconnected. And that's just one of the critical unmet needs that we face now. And there's so much more that we could do. And this is not rocket science, right? The bad news is that ideas like this have been put on the table before, more than once in our history, and they've been shot down every time. Shot down by political timidity, entrenched resistance, and our peculiar indifference to the lives of those people who are the predictable victims of our failure to make these kinds of public investments in our most basic public institutions. But there's also good news, which I wish we talked more about. Good news on this score. The good news is that there's been serious and important legislation passed in the last couple of years. It's being used to tackle these issues of joblessness and marginalization right now as we speak. Probably the most significant legislation we've seen in at least a generation in this country. The administration's successful infrastructure bill last year has already helped us launch, according to one estimate I recently saw, at least 6,000 projects across the country that are designed to help rebuild American communities, with a focus precisely on those communities that have historically been the most neglected and abandoned. And they're just getting started. They spent a couple of $100 billion out of the nearly $1 trillion that has been allocated for this program. The more recent inflation reduction bill on the national level, even though it got cut back a lot from where it started, will pump several $100 billion into projects that are aimed at fighting climate change. And in the process, it has the potential to create a lot more good jobs with decent wages. These things matter. They'll make a difference. And it's important to say so. They don't take us as far as I'd like, but they do challenge the all too common idea, even among people of goodwill, that there's not much that we can realistically do to alter these conditions that for generations have sown the seeds of violence and of racial disparities in violence in our country. And of course, there's a lot else that we need to do. I'll just mention one of them. One of the most crucial things we need to do is to finally pass some serious gun legislation at the national level. 94% of young Black men who died by violence in 2018 died of a gunshot. And those astonishingly sharp increases I was talking about a minute ago in violent death during the pandemic era have been fueled by a massive infusion of new guns into communities that were already awash in guns in the first place. What to do about this? Well, I think we actually may be poised for a real sea change in the way we address guns in America. I think for the first time in my memory, people are really getting fed up, and it's a wider and wider swath of people across the country. But that's only going to happen if we find leadership who are a lot bolder and a lot more dedicated than what we're used to. And that leads me to the kind of the main thought that I'd like to leave you with tonight, which is that we really need to raise the level of our game on this enduring crisis of violence. We need to be louder. We need to be unafraid to push for remedies that we know would make a difference, even if some folks predictably say that they can't be done or that nobody would support them. We have to stand up and say that it simply cannot be morally or socially tolerable in a country with our resources to allow the levels of needless death and human suffering that these cold numbers I've given you represent. We can't allow that to continue year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. That suffering is just as much a product of systemic racism as the parallel problem of violence by police. And it should make us just as angry. You know, I was struck recently by some anguished words that I read from somebody who was mourning the impact of violence, the toll that violence had taken on her community. She lived up in West Oakland here in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And in a letter to city officials, she wrote, "I don't know how many times I have to reiterate that we are in a crisis." And she concluded, "We refuse to normalize this. We refuse to normalize this." Well, we should all refuse to normalize this. We need to remember that there are lives at stake here, lots of lives. When I wrote my book, A Peculiar Indifference, I pointed out that since the turn of the 21st century up through 2018, about 162,000 Black Americans had died by violence. That's a number that's roughly equivalent to the population of a good-sized city like, say, Jackson, Mississippi. Over the next 2 years, that number grew by another 24,000. That's 24,000 lives that we might have saved through intelligent and compassionate social policy. So I, for one, can't imagine a moral universe in which that would be acceptable. I think I'll leave it right there. Thank you, and I'll open it up for discussion.
Questions for our guest?
Have you seen any areas in the country that you think are making some progress?
You know, I think I would have had a more positive answer before the last couple of years. I think we had successfully brought violence down somewhat in some places in the country, including some places here in California. In many places, unfortunately, that's been reversed. And I think the reasons for that lie in the fact that we really haven't been willing to bite the bullet, so to speak, and tackle the root causes. we've still been dancing around on the surface of this problem.
I would just add one statistic that to me does have a local character to it, and that is Black men born 2001 and after, 1 in 3 can be expected to be incarcerated at some time in their life.
Mm-hmm.
So you overlay that on your homicide rate, and doesn't leave a lot of room to people to live.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. And one of the interesting things, and I think something we don't talk about enough when it comes to incarceration, particularly incarceration of Black men, you know, there has been some change in our incarceration rate in the United States, especially for Black men. That incarceration rate has fallen in recent years from its heights, which were back around 2008, 2009. But that largely has to do with that process I mentioned a minute ago of no longer putting as many relatively minor offenders behind bars, or shortening their sentences. And that's been a very positive development. It's taken, thousands and thousands of people, often people of color, out of our prisons and jails. But at the same time, what the evidence shows is that for people who are committing more serious crimes, the sentences have become longer, not shorter. And we're putting those folks behind bars for either life sentences or years of sentences of something like 20 years to life at a much greater clip than we used to. So you have this very, very large core of continued incarceration that's keeping our levels up where they are, and they have been for many years, as the highest in the world.
Our speaker 2 months ago, Wellington Barlow, an attorney, did a database study for Florida that showed what sentences are, so they could use that database to make sure that the judge was presented with the data that showed what a normal sentence would be, as opposed to an extreme sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that's something that could be extended across the country.
Yeah, I think it could, and there is a fair amount of data that some organizations have been putting together on this. There's a group called the Prison Policy Institute that has collected some of this data. Another group is the Sentencing Project out of Washington, D.C. They've done some very interesting publications. They have a really nice report. Well, nice is maybe not the right word, since it's a very grim report on the growth of these extreme sentences and seeing where they have been, where this has happened the most and across what states. And it's a big trend. And again, I think it's something that we haven't talked about nearly enough.
I have a question. Good evening, and I thoroughly enjoyed your discussion, all of the information. It was so comprehensive, and I just feel like I want to go back and listen to it slowly. I particularly appreciated your reference to W.E.B. Du Bois. And what was the name of the first report that he wrote about Black people? Was it like the Negro something? It was.
Yeah, Philadelphia Negro.
The Philadelphia Negro. Okay, so that's what it was. And I know it was a large section about public health at that time.
Yes.
And so I work in maternal child health now.
Mm.
And I've been blessed with the privilege to have a position to focus on driving policies upstream to lessen Black infant deaths.
Uh-huh.
And so I know you've heard the statistics. If you're a Black woman, you have like a 3 times chance of not survive, of the baby not going past the first birthday. What would you, in your opinion, what type of policies would, help value Black babies? We talked about the different communities and how I feel like I am, guilty of just accepting the status quo and understanding like their particular zip codes where I was raised here, where there has not been, a lot of progress economically. But what would you just suggest a few?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think there's been a fair amount of studies of this, what goes wrong, both in terms of infant mortality and maternal mortality, as you say, where the statistics are really shocking. And I think what you can say in kind of shorthand is that there's two different things going on, which are related, of course, but they call for sort of separate solutions. One has to do with those larger social forces that are impacting mothers and kids, which, everything from the availability of good nutrition, for example, which is really important for both mother and kid, during pregnancy and thereafter. And the simple fact that in some communities, particularly low-income communities, it's much, much harder than it is in better off communities to access that kind of nutrition. The stresses of poverty itself, the stresses of unemployment, the stresses of not being able to pay the bills, the dangers in the immediate environment, which people have talked about a lot in terms of the, what lies in wait for babies once they're born up there, everything from, environmental toxins to higher rates of violence in the community and a whole lot of other stuff. So moving against those larger conditions of marginalization and poverty and lack of the basic resources that help kids to thrive is one prong, I think, of an attack on these disparities. But the other piece of it is inadequate medical care. So these things work together, right? And so we know, and this happens again and again, if you look at research on not just infant and maternal mortality, but other things like diabetes, for example, is another classic example, really, that the inferior care that's likely to be offered to Black Americans is a huge part of the problem.
Yeah,
a very big part of the problem. And that one, it seems to me, that's one of these things that really infuriates me, actually, because it's actually not that hard to fix. We can, you can look and you can see where the care that's being given is inadequate, where there's not enough doctors, there's not enough nurses, there's not enough public health outreach people to go out in the communities and talk to folks, talk to moms. And so I think the answer to that is pretty simple. You train some more of those people and you pay them, you devote some public resources to it, and you let them do their job. We haven't done that. And I think particularly in some states, as well as some inner cities, including, my hometown of Chicago, which I mentioned, you see really shocking things like, I've forgotten the exact number, but over the course of the last several years, several of the available maternal care clinics and maternal care parts of hospitals shut down. They're shut down. And so the capacity of women to be able to even find care during their pregnancy and thereafter really radically diminished. Well, what's that about? Somebody's not investing in these medical institutions. And again, I think, there's no mystery about how to fix that one.
Well, I have another question. I saw in your bio that you wrote a book, The Crisis of Adolescence. Did you cover like their health care services or I don't know. I read that there's an issue with a lack of data pertaining to adolescents' healthcare. And from World Health Organization, monies go to the babies and monies go to the elderly, not the middle group. So my question was, in your book, do you cover, their health, their public or their health, so they'll make it, like a holistic approach on their health? Or is it, more the environmental and their behaviors?
Yeah, Again, that's a great question. That particular book is one that I wrote mostly about middle-class white kids.
Ah,
I wrote it about middle-class white kids was because, you know, people somehow thought, oh, these folks are doing just fine. Well, they weren't. And I spent a lot of time interviewing them. I had a grant to study kids in particular who were in residential drug treatment because they had really, really serious drug problems. And so I learned a lot about them. And so the issue of healthcare did come up a lot for them in ways that I think people were a little bit surprised at when I discovered this, that some of the things that we understand happen with lower income kids or kids of color also happen to these kids. And the particular areas of healthcare that I was looking at most had to do with things like the availability of actually good drug treatment as opposed to kind of bogus drug treatment, which there's a lot of out there. Mental health care in particular, a lot of these kids really had mental health issues. And over again, I found that nobody had taken those seriously. You know, we always think that we have all these mental health services around and people can get all the care they want. No way. These kids, they had so much trouble accessing, you know, competent and caring mental health services in particular. And from every statistic I've ever seen, it is even worse for poorer kids. So, and you're right, you know, we don't collect nearly enough data on this kind of stuff.
When you're in a position, you can help with that.
I have thoroughly enjoyed
Okay,
listening.
it'll be in a few minutes. It's over at 8.
I think the
Thank
clearest picture I've had of the perspective of that you've given us on a national level of the major issues that are affecting the Black community and explaining the crime rate and other issues.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
I was
Absolutely.
just wondering, Professor Currie, about peculiar indifference.
Uh-huh.
In my experience, those kind of central issues are worth drilling down on. Have you done much of that? And, you know, where's the elephant in the room there? Where is the elephant in the room relative to that? Because I certainly feel it here in our community, the indifference.
The indifference. Yeah.
You know, the Black people were promised 50 years ago when they consolidated the city and county that their septic tanks would be taken care of, that their well water would be eliminated, and it's still there. And
Yeah.
we still have a very poor community. And it's you're right, it's indifference.
It is indifference. You know, I was sometimes I talk about that at more length when I talk about these issues. And I find we see such spectacular examples of this lately. I don't know if you followed the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi recently, which to me just absolutely encapsulates this whole problem that we've been talking about tonight. Because you see a couple of things hand in hand. You see that absolute incredible level of abandonment of that city, which is now I think it's 82% African-American city now. And of course, those two things are not accidental, that racial composition and the fact that it's been abandoned. And the water crisis where, you know, people couldn't access drinkable water. And they were even being told, this is the thing that sticks in my mind, right? They were being told to be sure to keep their mouth closed if they had to take a shower, because you didn't want to ingest any of that water. You could maybe rinse your body in it, but don't let any of it get into your mouth. And I'm imagining, you know, I'm thinking, this is an American city in 2022, and we're telling people they can't shower with an open mouth because the water around them is so toxic. So you take that level of abandonment, and the you know, materials I read about Jackson during this period also pointed out that the young kids in Jackson feel like they have no future whatsoever because there's no serious job training. There's no opportunity structure for them. And then you put that together with the fact that over the last couple of years, the homicide death rate in Jackson has skyrocketed like this. You can see a chart of it. It just goes like that. And those things, of course, are very closely connected. The skyrocketing levels of violence with that astonishingly pervasive sense of abandonment and neglect in that city. Now, I think you're asking, though, Dennis, where does that come from? How do we explain it? And I think it really is about indifference. It's about part of it simply has to do with plain old-fashioned racism, I think. Part of it has to do with long-standing ideologies that we have about why people are poor and marginalized in the first place. We tend to blame it on those folks and not think about it in structural terms. We don't think about the larger economic forces that have destroyed opportunity for kids in Jackson, for example. We think there's something wrong with those folks, and we still think that way. And then there's also the simple fact, I think, that a lot of the people who are most affected by this indifference don't have much political voice, visibility, or political power. And in the absence of some larger social commitment to doing something about these problems, that's what it would take to make the change. But they don't have the tools to make the change, at least so far, lacking some pretty extraordinary degree of their own political mobilization. They don't really have the tools to make that change or the power to make that change happen. As I was saying, I think that the one piece of good news about this is that there has been some pretty compelling national legislation, which is now beginning to reach into exactly that kind of community to make some difference. And I think we need to watch this very carefully and see just how much difference it makes. Because somebody did care enough to pass that legislation to fight against entrenched resistance to spending that government money on these abandoned communities.
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, actually, our organization and some of our partners are very active in workforce development and with regard to those projects.
Great.
Transportation and other projects. So we have our fingers crossed as well.
Yeah.
Well, I see that it's 8:01. I think I'll take one more question if anyone has one.
I want to make a brief comment, Dennis. There was one good story you may have heard of, Elliot, about what the Kellogg Foundation and the churches in New Orleans did. The churches got together, Kellogg helped fund it. And in the first year, they cut the death rate 80%. The next year, they cut the death rate. I'm giving you approximate numbers. They cut the death rate again about 80% from murders. So the thing could happen very quickly if we could get a community approach.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point about how quickly change can happen. You know, I always talk about these problems as being very entrenched, very long-standing problems, and that's true. But that doesn't mean they can't be turned around quickly if we put those resources in there. And I think especially if we do in fact get the people at most risk involved. So if we get youth involved in that process of transforming their own living conditions, their own communities, their own opportunities, that I think is the really promising approach. So we're not just doing some top-down thing, but we're involving young folks in this process from the get-go. And that gives them something, not just a job, not just some more money, but gives them this sense of participating in something that's larger than themselves, in the building of their own communities. And I think that's where the hope really lies.
Well, I think with that, we'll we have as I explained to Dr. Currie, we definitely stick to our hour because we don't want people to come or be afraid to come because it'll stretch on too long. And so I just wanted to thank you for joining us, and I wanted to thank Mr. Malone for bringing you to us. He's really the person that helped us get this started, and we're most appreciative. Also want to appreciate, I see Jamie Krasnogor, our intern coordinator. I see Julie Miller, an alumnus intern on, and without them and others like them, we couldn't do this. So wanted to thank everybody, and on behalf of the Jacksonville Urban League, thank all of you for attending. I urge you to go to our YouTube website or YouTube site for the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice. This recording will be there, and others that you may find interesting that explore this subject. So again, thank you, everyone, and we wish you all a great night and a great holiday, and we'll see you in January.
Thanks for the invitation, Dennis.
Oh, thank you so much for joining
Appreciate
us.
it. Thank you.